in institutions. While I've done street research for 35 years in Milwaukee and Chicago, and one of my books compared gangs in Chicago to Rio de Janeiro and Cape Town. I've traveled the world. Almost none of that sort of prepared me for dealing with the gangs in court and the power of stereotypes. A lot of stuff in the streets, but then you get into the court, and where we're supposed to have a weighing of the evidence, and we're supposed to focus on the facts of the case. I found that that there's much more about frames than facts. And let me just give you an example before we jump into there's a case I had many years ago in Georgia, in Milledgeville. Anyone from Georgia here? Georgia? All right, in the back. What was Milledgeville? Milledgeville was the capital of the Confederacy, right? So this is an all-white jury, 2 black guys, members of the Folks Gang. And the Folks Gang is the name for gangster disciples in Georgia. And so the trial is revolving around these 2 kids were guilty of it, and so the prosecutor is really bringing in as much gang evidence as he can. And so he brings Ricky Horn up, who's the Milledgeville gang squad expert. And Ricky is a wonderful character. I've got to know him through all this process. They qualified him as an expert in this case. He said, well, I went to a seminar once in Atlanta, but most of what I know about gangs I get from TV and the movies. And Ricky is one of those honest police officers who are out there. And so Ricky's asked by Fred Bright, the prosecutor, what does folks stand for? And Ricky says, followers of our Lord King Satan. Now, of course, that's ridiculous. Folks are a folk name. When I testified, I brought along a letter from a Chicago gang squad officer saying that was the most ridiculous thing he ever heard. But you got to think about this jury who's weighing the death penalty in this case. Young, black, male, gang member, convicted of murder, devil worshiper. There isn't not much else was needed to be weighed, and you figured out that they didn't take very long to come back with death sentences for both of those young men. And lest we think that Ricky made this up, we subpoenaed the police manual, and you can see in the bottom here, the police are instructed to say, when you mention the Folks Gang, say that they're followers of our Lord King Satan. And that, I just had a case a few months ago, and the police were saying the same thing in Georgia, and it's not just there. So what this raises in looking at justice and looking at taking place in court is something that you might be very familiar with, as sort of a causal schema here of a stimulus and response. And what I've concluded is that gang members going to trial, and many of them have done terrible things, but the presumption of innocence is gone because of the power of stereotypes. And I don't work with your literatures. I work with the framing literature from communication, Robert Entman, and in sociology, Goffman, and the social cognition literature, Susan Fiske and George Lakoff. So I'm using some different literatures, and what I'm going to try to do in the talk is support through theory and practice this argument that I'm making, that stereotypes present some nearly insuperable obstacles to justice. So let's start with words, all right? So if we want to know what a word means or what it's associated with, we should ask a Frenchman. And we'll ask Roger here of what this American, and there you can see this is the word, how Roger looks at the thesaurus. There's the limo Satan in there, everything but followers, scum. I mean, you know, this is, a gang member is, you know, we already know a gang member is someone that's bad. But I know linguistics is a major part of your discipline, and it's, you know, very much in social cognition. I'm more of an image guy, and I think that words represent images that are tied to emotions. And so what I want to do real quickly is a brief experiment with you, okay? So I'm going to ask you all, in your mind here, think of a gang member. Think of what the gang member is doing, all right? Okay, you ready? Can you close your eyes for 1 second? Okay, now, how many had her in mind? How many had women in mind? All right, we got, okay, there we go. How many had white people in mind? We a couple of people. All right, here's the kicker. How many of you, when you thought about what the gang member was doing, had them doing the dishes? Yeah. So there's hundreds of thousands of white gang members and female gang members. And do you think gang members do more dishes or drive-bys, right? In terms of their regular activity. Now, with my kids, the number would be the same, right? You know. But we have an image that's much different in our mind than this image. She could be a gang member, I suppose. But since none of you have a picture of a gang member with you, right, that I could show here. You don't carry them around. So we'll ask Google, right? What does Google think a gang member? Let's see how close Google is to our young woman doing the dishes. Whoops, there's the #1 hit, you know, and every given day it's somebody else, but it looks a lot like this guy who you really wouldn't want your daughter to bring home here. And this is the image that is formed, and I'm not going to get into prototype theory here, but it's a prototype, and it's something very deeply embedded in the way we think about what a gang member is, and it colors the way we look at anyone who has the label gang member associated. And of course, here's a word cloud on stereotypes or false generalizations. And one of the things about stereotypes we learned from the social cognition is that they're automatically activated, oversimplified, overgeneralized. And here's the key thing: difficult to change and strongly influence emotions, judgments, and behaviors like a jury. Now, not being a word guy, I like Walter Lippmann's definition of stereotype much better. He says it's a picture in your mind, right? So to me, there's that picture that's difficult to change. It's there. We judge everything else with it. And we can't dissociate the picture of a gang member from its racialized origins. And Susan Fisk said, well, what is the racial schema, the sort of the foundational stereotypes, the deep-seated beliefs we have? Blacks are dirty and physically skilled, militant, violent, criminal, and hostile. And this is a national opinion research poll, random sample of Americans saying that the majority think blacks are more violent, dumber, and lazier than others. And another literature we won't get into, which you're probably familiar with, is the neuroscience literature. And for our purposes here, fMRI scans show that the amygdala reacts when an outgroup is present. In other words, a jury will look at a black person there, and a category of gang will come up, a category of black person, and then they're tried. Those categories will come up that they're an outgroup, they're not us. And does gang matter? Well, we have mock jury studies that take the same trial, same evidence, and alter the condition gang, former gang and non-gang, and no surprise, you know, gangs are significantly more likely gang members to be convicted than the other categories. And these stereotypes, these labels, this stigma, it's sort of like with Ricky Horn reading out of the manual, they're consciously promoted. And this is from, and we know this because we can read what the prosecutors are saying about how to prosecute gang trials, right? And so what the complaining that the defense attorneys raise the issue of the gang evidence is prejudicial, and in the manual it says that prosecutors should say, of course it is, that's the point. Prejudicial evidence is the point, right? They understand the power of stereotypes. And further, and we're going to see this in some of the examples, that gang evidence can explain the inexplicable. In other words, they don't have a motive, you know, that the evidence is sketchy. Let's bring gangs into the whole thing. Typically, and the Milledgeville case was one, but I had half a dozen cases where the prosecutor will question the gang squad officer, and he'll say, well, and he'll ask him, why was this crime committed? And the gang squad officer will say, he did it to gain status in the gang. Well, in the Milledgeville case, I talked to both of the people. I talked to other, who were in different gangs, by the way, who committed this crime, and talked to other people around in the area, other gang members. There's absolutely no evidence whatsoever that this crime, which was a robbery, was gang-related, was done to gain status in the gang, except they read it from the manual on stereotypes of gangs, and it's very convenient, it passes, and it's done again and again and again so they can explain the inexplicable. And we know if we hold these stereotypes, we got that image in our head, right, of this guy, you know, that's sitting there as a gang member, evidence that's consistent with that stereotype is going to be welcomed. Evidence that's discrepant is going to be scrutinized, which makes cases different. And let me do an example of this. Is one of my first cases, and it was a success, so I always talk about this case, and very few of them end up as success, but it illustrates the power of stereotypes. So I get a call in 1996 from a defense attorney, and he had a client, Timothy Shanks, who was a carny worker from Gary, African-American guy, and two guys that he knew committed a homicide and to recover a debt, and they said to try to cut a deal, they said, Timothy Shanks is the leader of a gangster disciples, and they're coming into Minnesota. And so Freak Out City, the Minnesota Attorney General's office, sends a brace of attorneys to Mahnomen, which is 235 miles northwest of Minneapolis. Now, the logic of why the gangster disciples would invade Mahnomen, it's really escaped me the whole time. But they took it seriously, and so they're prosecuting the case. And the case, you talk about the power of stereotypes. This case was built on a scaffolding of frames, not facts. And let me tell you all of the evidence in this case. Timothy Shanks was this carny worker, African American, a faded tattoo, gangster disciple tattoo on his arm from when he was a kid. He was at a party. Two guys came up to him and said, this guy owes us money and won't pay, and he said, do what you gotta do. The plea bargain, they said that he was the head of a gangster disciple cell, and he was accused of being a pharaoh in the gangster disciples, which were led by King David Hoover. Shanks, the last piece of evidence was Shanks called himself an OG, and repeatedly greeted people with the damning phrase, "What's up, folks?" So, my testimony was, first, there's some problems with the evidence. There's no such thing as a pharaoh in the gangster disciples. It's a rank from a different gang, right? David Barksdale and Larry Hoover are two separate people, and David Barksdale is dead, and Larry Hoover is in prison. An OG is a common phrase that people use to talk about former gang members. It's a phrase of being an elder, you're retired. But it's also a common phrase for people on the street. I'm an OG, meaning I got street knowledge, I can talk to you young whippersnappers or whatever they call them. And it's not necessarily even gang related. But the kicker of the testimony in this case, which is beginning to unravel in front of the prosecutor's eyes in this case, was that I testified that if "What's up, folks?"
That's all, folks.
I testified if that is the defining characteristic, that he's a gang member and that he killed, we got a lot of people we could indict. And so the judge just throws up his hands at this point. And, you know, he had known the defense attorney and he had urged him not to take it, but he had seen enough. And he calls the Minnesota Attorney General's office up and he just says, "Ladies and gentlemen, what you going to do?" And they say, "Well, we'll drop the charges." And Peter Cannon, bless his heart, pulls it in his pocket and comes up with money and gives it to Timothy Shanks, and maybe you need to get out of Minnesota and stay far away from here. So this is a case built on stereotypes and nothing else. And it's common that cases are built on stereotypes, but it's not common that the people that I testify for are innocent. Timothy Shanks was undoubtedly innocent of anything. Most of the people are guilty, and that the attorneys look at a due process model, looking at fairness and all that, and I'm very sympathetic. And the prosecutors, this is Packer's control model and due process model. Prosecutors think it's all about getting the bad guy, right? And, you know, corners get cut, whatever, but people shouldn't get away with murder, and I am in agreement with that. I also, in trying to justify working in this area, I looked back to the roots of demonization in Western culture, and what I see in court are morality plays that are going on, of the view that the people, the gang members, that they are consistent with their stereotypes, they're evil, they're followers of our Lord King Satan, you know, and that these are people that you can't do anything with and deserve the most harsh punishment. You know, I take a different view that we should punish evil deeds. Well, I think demonization is an extremely serious flaw in our culture, and it needs to be opposed. And I have a strong belief in rehabilitation, like our system has had until the 1970s. So the whole thing gets worse. The further you go into theory, the more things you find that stack the deck against somebody who's accused of being a gang member. This is Alpert's from The Nature of Prejudice, 1954. It's a seminal work in social psychology, and he's talking about just seeing someone with a black skin activates that stereotype, right? Seeing a gang member activates that picture of Google guy back there. And other theory, attribution theory, explains the working of jurors, right? You have a stereotype, you've got a case here, and so the answer to what the causal chain, the attribution, is that he must be guilty. It's a very difficult chain. In my entire career in the courts, the work I've been doing, research on stereotypes, my motto has been to try to crack that chain, that it's not automatic. You need evidence. And there's even some more esoteric theory, a terror management theory, which what it says is that when confronted by death, we tend to more strongly adhere to our in-group and to hold on to stereotypes because we're afraid, we're holding on to what we know. And a trial, a death penalty trial, a homicide, a capital trial is the definition of that. So all sorts of things can cue and prime these conceptions. let me tell you about a case of Patrick Stout in Tennessee. That's his tattoo. Patrick was a young kid, joined a little neighborhood gang that they affiliated with the gangster disciples, and he really wasn't in much trouble. He finally ended up doing something silly. He went to jail, got confronted by in Memphis, the gangster disciples in Memphis, and they wanted to take his shoes. He said no, and they said, well, we're going to violate you out of the gang. You're not a real gangster, and they beat him with an inch of his life, and he left. Now, he then tried to take the tattoo off. He subsequently gets involved with a bunch of guys, and someone is killed in a robbery. And I tell you, I've talked to Patrick several times. I've read the case record. I've gone through all this stuff. I don't know if he did it. He says he didn't. There's other plausible offenders in the case, but the thing is that I couldn't figure it out, and I'm pretty savvy and street smart, whatever. The prosecutor couldn't figure that out either, right? And so what do you do in a case where the evidence is shaky, right? Well, you resort to the gang label, right? We call it a super frame, right? So what they did in Patrick's case is they elicited some testimony about did the grandfather know that he had a tattoo? And he said, oh, no, he didn't. So, oh, well, the prosecutor said, Your Honor, have Patrick show his tattoo to the jury. And Patrick says, I'm not going to do that. I'm not. And then the judge said, take your shirt off and walk in front of the jury. And if you think that reminds you of a slave auction, something like that, it reminded Patrick of that too, a smart guy. He said, I'm not going to do it. The judge said, then we're going to have the deputy sheriffs rip your shirt off and drag you in front of the jury. And the jury is there listening to all this, right? And so Patrick goes and shows his tattoos. They're all as innocuous as that one to the jury. And I get involved with this case on habeas. In other words, death penalty cases trigger reviews, and the attorneys looked at ineffective counsel because this guy's defense attorney was sat there like a potted plant, and while they drag his client in front of a jury showing his tattoo. So I came in and I said, well, first of all my knowledge of tattoos this is really pretty sorry for a tattoo that's showing a hardcore gang member. And secondly, I brought along a letter. This sort of surprised the court, from a member of the national board of the gangster disciples, and there is such a thing, or there was back then, that said that this was not in any way a sanctioned tattoo, that he shows up in Chicago, they beat the crap out of him, that this is testimony that he's a wannabe and has no idea what he's dealing with. And the prosecutor used the tattoo as the clinching evidence that he is a hardcore evil gang member and he needed to be put to death. And my testimony, had it been given, was that that tattoo is the evidence of the exact opposite. That it's amateurish, it didn't even fully represent the symbols. He didn't even know what the symbols represented. In this case, moderate victory, the death penalty was thrown out in this case, but the conviction stood, and he's currently serving life in Tennessee. The other case, this is a funny little drawing in the corner. I was in Atlanta a few months ago, and I can't use the real names here because the case is still being litigated, but I took it, it's not a death penalty case or a capital case, it was a shooting. And I decided to do it because the issues were so clear. I called them egregious in court, and the judge said, egregious? So here's a shooting over a girl. And somebody disrespected a girl and a guy gets shot. And the victim is identifying different people as the shooter. And whatever happens steering, he settles on Mr. Smith, or defendant. And so they arrest him, but they got a problem in the court. that only a stereotype can solve, right? They have a problem is that the evidence is so shaky, there's no way they're going to get a conviction. The guy has, identified everybody who was there as the shooter. Why are they going to pick this guy out? Well, here's what they do. They magically transform this shooting over a girl that always was talked about as a girl as a gang-related hit, that Mr. Smith shot the victim because he was false flagging. And where did they learn this from? A jailhouse snitch who conveniently comes forward and said, Mr. Smith told me that he shot him because he was false flagging in the gang. But that's a little, not quite, enough to do it. So they searched his cell and they come up with a note. And the note, you can't read the writing on the note, but the note says, if you testify against me, I'm going to kill you. And the clincher was, they put the 6-pointed GD star down there. And first time I looked at it, I said, yeah, well, so. Then I looked again, and I realized the points are numbered, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Well, 4 and 7. 7-4 is gangster disciple. This is a really complex code, right? The numbers stand for letters. Nobody at all would use those numbers on the star. It's an obvious forgery, and it, as is the snitch's testimony, a desperate attempt to use stereotypes, to use the demonization of gangs to bolster a case. Now, I don't know whether this guy did it or not. It likely is not to me. But my sense was that he should be convicted on evidence, not stereotypes. And the case was even worse. They brought in some gang squad officer who showed videos of pictures of people killed in Atlanta by gangs and graffiti. And what did that have to do with the case? Well, it had everything to do with the case because it explained the inexplicable. So let's watch a few seconds of this.
As officers walk the Lady D's into police headquarters, the women continue to show their loyalty to the gang.
That was Jackie Martinez, and the girl to her right over there is Madeline Mendoza, and they had another defendant, Marilyn Malero, in the 90s. And Jackie I've been working with Jackie's case for 8 or 9 years. Jackie was one of 3 maniac Latin disciples that killed 2 Latin kings in Humboldt Park, and no question, they shot and they killed them, retaliation for an earlier killing. And so this was a sort of a sensational case. You got girls killing male gang members, and so the scuttlebutt on the street is that Jackie was involved. She was the head of the Lady D's, the Lady Disciples, and they pick her up and take her over to Latin King turf, say, if you don't confess, we're going to dump you, standard practice. She's 15, they don't allow her mother, or they don't allow an attorney in, they get her to waive her rights, and they interrogate her through the night, and she confesses. Now, that's important, you figure case over, right? And the reality is that all of us have to deal with is she's guilty of a crime. So the trial takes place, and the confession, what's important about the confession is that, of course, it gets thrown out on appeal, right? Which leaves them with no evidence in the case. And so there's a frantic in the second trial, trying to figure out a way they can reintroduce the confession, and they succeed in it. And she's still in prison. She's due to be resentenced because of the Miller decision overturning juvenile life without parole. But at the trial, it's an amazing transcript. I have a student writing her dissertation on it. Cold-blooded assassin, ruthless gang member, teen queen of criminals. And the heart of it that struck my interest in this is that she killed for one reason and one reason only, gang violence. Is that the narrative, the frame, right? The gang frame was there to demonize this young woman, that she was inherently evil and the only thing was going on was gang retaliation. But you know, framing suggests that, you know, when you have a frame, what do you do? You look inside the frame, and there's the young killer, Jackie Martinez. But you know, there's things that are outside the frame that don't get attended to in cognition and get avoided. And in this case, the judge ruled out anything but gang-related testimony in the trial. So there's a lot of other Jackies here. Most important one is the young girl in red over here. That's Jackie at age 7, when, as her stepfather, Latin King, began to rape and beat her. And every time she ran away, and she repeatedly ran away, the police brought her back to Daddy. Finally, she ran away and joined the rival gang, the Maniac Latin Disciples, duh, right? And I'm interviewing her in Dwight Correctional, where she was incarcerated. And I said to her, I'd been there a couple times, and I sort of comfortable in talking to her, and I said that we got to go deep here, and I need you to close your eyes and walk through the events that happened leading to these 2 shootings. And we walked through it, and she was clearly reliving each step of what happened, and she got done with the shooting, and she broke down and cried and said, "It was my stepfather I wanted to shoot, not them." Duh, if you know anything about the literature of females and violence, you could predict that. Jackie is not she's got her GED from prison. She's not a trained psychologist, but she understands the fundamental attributional error, right? She said, it was just I did what you said I did, but I'm not who you say I am, right? It's the crime, it's the act. And the kicker about this case is that nobody knew this about her, not the prosecutor, the media, the judge, or even her own defense attorney. That frame was so strong of the gang that they never bothered to look into her background and to figure this out. And anybody with understands violence of women, it's the first thing that would come to your mind. But the inability to see outside the frame, Lakoff says, when that frame is hard, the facts bounce off. You don't even attend to them, is the essence of this case. And she, in the next few months, she's going to finally get a hearing that, and a sentence will be based on what happened to her life as well as the severity of the crime. And you know, she's always been very forthright about what she did, but she's not a monster. So, tailing down here, there's a lot of discussion and debate in the literature about the malleability of implicit assumptions. There's a whole literature of implicit association tests and all that stuff. But the key thing, you know, is that the conclusion about changing these implicit associations requires long-term exposure to the other group. This is not a jury at a trial, right? There is very little reason to think the jury is going to change their implicit stereotypes. And that means that the cognitive shortcuts we use that go from stereotype to conclusion, the attributions, are automatic. So, is it hopeless? You know, when you do this stuff as long as I do, and there's so many cases that you come and, you know, you watch the gang testimony, just the jurors, just in that Patrick Stout case, we knew we couldn't use it on appeal, but we knew that the jury, when they went back, the foreman of the jury was a school teacher, said, "I've seen that tattoo before. That tattoo means," and going on and on about the tattoo, right? This stuff is difficult to deal with. So it's not hopeless, but it's bleak. And so I just want to talk a little bit about what it means. It's sort of what I do in courts and try to undermine those stereotypes. You know, one is subtyping, that you realize that the stereotype is so strong, you really can't dent it. And so you say, well, the stereotype is there, but my client ain't like that. Maybe he can whistle Vivaldi. If some of you familiar with Claude Steele's stereotype threat. So Claude is talking about Brent Staples, African-American writer for the New York Times, moves to Hyde Park and decides to go jogging, and he's wearing ghetto attire, a jogging suit, and people are looking at him, and he sees, oh my God, they think I'm, one of them. And so his solution is to whistle Vivaldi, and that puts the Europeans at ease that he's one of them, sort of, right? So you can try to get your client to whistle Vivaldi. There's lateral inhibition, fit them into a different group, whatever. Limited success with some of these things. The major way, and what I try to do is making stereotypes conscious by testifying on it, stereotypes, but emphasizing variability in gangs, which causes jurors that are motivated to want to think and make distinctions here, right, between people. We, dual process models and, look at how jurors move from stereotype to individualizing. If they're highly motivated and hold egalitarian values, if you've read descriptions of juries, that doesn't always describe them. And one of the sad things about this is that it's important that all the literature says that any emotion, anything that goes beyond sort of cold, rational discussions is dangerous because emotion gets in the way of rationally processing a case and looking and thinking it through. So we have an example, a great example of making stereotypes conscious. This is, you may recognize Clarence Darrow, and you probably don't recognize Dr. Ossian Sweet, but this is one of the great stereotyping and prejudice trials in American history. 1923, Dr. Sweet moves his family into an all-white neighborhood in Detroit, and a friendly neighbor welcome wagon of about 5,000 people greet them, and resembles more of a lynch mob than a welcome wagon. So they're freaked out, and Dr. Lynch has a hunting rifle, and he shoots into the crowd and kills a guy, and so they charge everyone with murder. And Clarence Darrow arrives, at the trial, and he's got to figure out, and just, how the hell do I deal with that? So you got an all-white, all-male jury, right? And so his approach to this case was real simple. He says, now, gentlemen, I say you're prejudiced. Don't tell me you aren't. I know better. And he goes on and talks about prejudice and the prejudice that they feel and makes it all very conscious. But he appeals to their higher values. He says, but you're better than that. And we have very few Clarence Darrows in our system today, but Clarence Darrow managed to convince that jury that indeed, Dr. Sweet should not be convicted of murder. So we're going to conclude with another image. All right. So, and just a basic discernment. And I want you to, look through the stereotypes and figure this out, and tell me who's the felon here. Well, the answer is both of them. Snoop has a long history of arrests and convictions of felonies, and we know the kind of evil person Martha Stewart is. But the point of stereotypes and these images is that when you're looking at them, when you're thinking about it, you got to think again and again and again. You can't just settle for the easy answer, that we can attend to our deep-seated stereotypes, or even the easy answers to them. The facts are often much more complex. And the secret to this work in a jury boils down to saying to them, you're better than that, and to try to think this through. Thank you. We indeed have time for questions, if there are any. I've been advised to have people go to the microphone if they want to ask questions, so it can be recorded.